Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Book the second, Reaping. Chapter 5, Men and Masters. "Well, Stephen," said Bounderby, in his windy manner, "what's this I hear? What have these pests of the earth been doing to you? Come in and speak up." It was into the drawing-room that he was thus bidden. A tea-table was set out, and Mr. Bounderby's young wife and her brother and a great gentleman from London were present, to whom Stephen made his obeisance, closing the door and standing near it with his hat in his hand. "This is the man I was telling you about, Harthouse," said Mr. Bounderby. The gentleman he addressed, who was talking to Mrs. Bounderby on the sofa, got up, saying in an indolent way, "Oh, really?" and dawdled to the hearthrug where Mr. Bounderby stood. "Now," said Mr. Bounderby, "speak up." After the 4 days he had passed, this address fell rudely and discordantly on Stephen's ear. Besides being a rough handling of his wounded mind, it seemed to assume that he really was the self-interested deserter he'd been called. "What were it, sir?" said Stephen, "as you were pleased to want with me?" "Why, I've told you," returned Bounderby. "Speak up like a man, since you are a man, and I'll tell you about yourself and this combination." "Wi' your pardon, sir," said Stephen Blackpool, "I had naught to sen about it." Mr. Bounderby, who was always more or less like a wind, finding something in his way here, began to blow at it directly. "Now, look here, Harthouse," said he, "here's a specimen of 'em. When this man was here once before, I warned this man against the mischievous strangers who are always about, and who ought to be hanged wherever they're found. And I told this man that he was going in the wrong direction. Now, would you believe it, that although they've put this mark upon him, he is such a slave to them still that he's afraid to open his lips about them?" "I said as I had naught to send, sir, not as I was fearful of opening my lips." "You said, I know what you said, more than that. I know what you mean, you see, not always quite the same thing, by the Lord Harry, quite different things. You'd better tell us at once that fellow Slackbridge is not in the town stirring up the people to mutiny, and that he's not a regular qualified people of the leader of the people. That is a most confounded scoundrel. You'd better tell us so at once. You can't deceive me. You want to tell us so? Why don't you?" "I'm as sorry as you are, sir, when the people's leaders is bad," said Stephen, shaking his head. "They take such as offers. Haply 'tis now the smartest of their misfortunes that they can get no better." The wind began to get boisterous. "Now, you'll think this pretty well, Harthouse," said Mr. Bounderby. "You'll think this tolerably strong. You'll say, upon my soul, this is a tidy specimen of what my friends have to deal with. This is nothing, sir. You shall hear me ask this man a question. Pray, Mr. Blackpool," wind springing up very fast, "may I take the liberty of asking you how it happens that you refuse to be in this combination?" "How it happens?" "Ah," said Mr. Bounderby, with his thumbs in his arms of his coat, jerking his head and shutting his eyes in confidence with the opposite wall. "How it happens?" "I'd liefer not come to it, sir, but sin you put the question, and not wanting to be ill-mannered, I'll answer. I ha' passed a promise." "Not to me, you know," said Bounderby, gusty weather with deceitful calms, one now prevailing. "Oh no, sir, not to you." "As for me, any consideration for me has just nothing to do at all to do with it," said Bounderby, still in confidence with the wall. "If only Josiah Bounderby of Coketown had been in question, you would have joined and made no bones about it." "Why, yes, sir, 'tis true." "Though he knows," said Mr. Bounderby, now blowing a gale, "that there are a set of rascals and rebels whom transportation is too good for. Now, Mr. Harthouse, you've been knocking about in this world some time. Did you ever meet with anybody like that man out of this blessed country?" And Mr. Bounderby pointed him out for inspection with an angry finger. "Nay, ma'am," said Stephen Blackpool, staunchly protesting against the words that had been used, and instinctively addressing himself to Louisa after glancing at her face. "Not rebels, nor yet rascals. Now to the kind, ma'am, now to the kind. They've not done me a kindness, ma'am, as I know and feel. But there's not a dozen men among 'em, ma'am, a dozen. Not 6, but what believes as he's doing his duty by the rest and by himself. God forbid as I, that ha' known and had experience of these men all my life, I that ha' seen 'em drunken and setting 'em with 'em and toiling with 'em and loving 'em, should fail fur to stand 'em by with the truth, let 'em a down to me what they may." He spoke with the rugged earnestness of his place and character, deepened perhaps by a proud consciousness that he was faithful to his class under all their mistrust, but he fully remembered where he was, and did not even raise his voice. No, ma'am, no. They're true to one another, faithful for one another, affectionate to one another, e'en to death. Be poor among 'em, be sick among 'em, grieve among 'em, for ony of the money causes the grief to the poor man's door, and they'll be tender wi' you, gentle wi' you, comfortable wi' you, christen wi' you. Be sure of that, ma'am. They'd be riven to bits, ere ever they'd be different. In short, said Mr. Bounderby, it becomes, they are so full of virtues that they've turned you adrift. Go through with it while you're about it. Out with it. How 'tis, ma'am, resumed Stephen, appearing still to find his natural refuge in Louisa's face, that what is best in us folk seems to turn us most to trouble and misfortune and mistake, I dunno, but 'tis so. I know 'tis, as I know the heavens is over me ain't the smoke. We're patient too, and wants in general to do right, and I canna think the fault is all wi' us. Now, my friend, said Mr. Bounderby, whom he could not have exasperated more, quite unconscious of it though he was, than by seeming to appeal to anyone else, if you will favour me with your attention for half a minute, I should like to have a word or two with you. You said just now that you had nothing to tell us about this business. You're quite sure of that before we go any further? Sir, I'm sure on it. Here's a gentleman from London present, said Mr. Bounderby, made a backhanded point at Mr. James Harthouse with his thumb. A Parliament gentleman. I should like him to hear a short bit of dialogue between you and me, instead of taking the substance of it, for I know precious well beforehand what it will be. Nobody knows better than I do. Take notice, instead of receiving it on trust from my mouth. Stephen bent his head to the gentleman from London and showed a rather more troubled mind than usual. He turned his eyes involuntarily to his former refuge, but at a look from that quarter, expressive though instantaneous, he settled them on Mr. Bounderby's face. Now, what do you complain of? Asked Mr. Bounderby. I ha' not come here, sir, Stephen reminded him, to complain. I come for that I was sent for. What? Repeated Mr. Bounderby, folding his arms. Do you people in general complain of? Stephen looked at him with a little irresolution for a moment, and then seemed to make up his mind. Sir, I were never good at showing out, though I had had my share of feeling on it. Indeed, we are in a muddle, sir. Look round town, so rich as it is, and see the numbers of people have been broughten into being here, for to weave and to card and to piece out a living, all the same one way, somehows, twixt their cradles and their graves. Look how we live, and where we live, and in what numbers, and by what chances, and with what sameness. Look how the mills is always a-going, and always at works, us no nigher on any distant object, except in always death. Look how you considers of us, and writes of us, and talks of us, and goes up with your deputations to secretaries of state about us, and how you're always right, and how we're always wrong, and never hadn't reason in us to sin, sin we were born. Look how this a-growin' and growin', sir, bigger and bigger, broader and broader, harder and harder fra year to year, fra generation unto generation. Who can look on it, sir, and fairly tell a man 'tis not a muddle? Of course, said Mr. Bounderby. Now perhaps you'll let the gentleman know how you would set this muddle, as you're so fond of calling it, to rights. I dunno, sir. I canna be expectant to it. 'Tis not me as should be looking as to that, sir. 'Tis them as is put over me and over the rest of us. What do they take upon themselves, sir, if not to do it? I'll tell you somewhat towards it, at any rate, returned Mr. Bounderby. We will make an example of half a dozen Slackbridges. We'll indict the blackguards for felony, and get 'em shipped off to penal settlements. Stephen gravely shook his head. Don't tell me we won't, man, said Mr. Bounderby, by this time blowing a hurricane, because we will, I tell you. Sir, replied Stephen, with the quiet confidence of absolute certainty, if you was to take in 100 Slackbridges, always there is, and all the number 10 times toward, and was to sew 'em up in separate sacks and sink 'em in the deepest ocean as were ever made, ere dry land come to be, you'd leave the muddle just where it is. Mischievous strangers, said Stephen with an anxious smile. When are we not here, I'm sure, sin we ever called to mind the mischievous strangers? 'Tis not by them the trouble's made, 'tis not with them to commences. I ha' no favour for them, I ha' no reason to favour 'em, but 'tis hopeless and useless to dream o' taking 'em from their trade, 'stead o' taking their trade fro' them. All that's now about me in this room were here afore I come, and will be here when I'm gone. Put that clock aboard a ship and pack it off to Norfolk Island, and the time will go on just the same. So 'tis with Slackbridge every bit." Reverting for a moment to his former refuge, he observed a cautionary movement of her eyes towards the door. Stepping back, he put his hand upon the lock, but he had not spoken out of his own will and desire, and felt his heart a noble return for his late injurious treatment, to be faithful to the last to those who had repudiated him. He stayed to finish what was in his mind. "Sir, I canna, with my little learning and my common way, tell the gentleman what will better or this, though some working men of the town could, above my powers. But I can tell him what I know will never do it. The strong hand will never do it. Victory and triumph will never do it. Agreeing for to make one side and unnaturally always and forever right, and t'other side unnaturally always and forever wrong, will never, never do it. Nor yet letting alone will never do it. Let thousands upon thousands alone, all leading the like lives and all falling into the muddle, and they will be as one, and you will be as another, with a black, unpassable world betwixt you, just as long or short as time as stitch misery can last. Not drawing nigh to folk with kindness and patience and cheery ways, that so draws nigh to one another in their money troubles, and so cherishes one another in their distresses with what they need themselves, like I humbly believe, as no people the gentleman's ever seen in his travels can beat, will never do it till the sun turns to ice. Most of all, rating them as so much power, and regulating them as if they were figures in a sum or machines, without loves and likings, without memories and inclinations, without souls to weary and souls to hope, when all goes quiet, dragging on with 'em as if they nowt of the kind, when they goes on quiet,